Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. In a quiet corner of America, where the woods grow thick and the soil remembers every secret buried in it, there was once a family whose story never belonged in daylight. It began in one bedroom, a small creaking room with thin walls and no escape. What happened inside it would spread like a disease across generations. From that single room, a family tree was born, not through love, not through choice, but through cycles of isolation, shame, and repetition. And as the years passed, the tree twisted itself into something unrecognizable. Its branches bent inward, folding over themselves, until the children it produced no longer looked like the rest of us. What came out of that room was not just a family, but a curse that would stain their bloodline forever. When you look back at the earliest stories, what strikes you is the silence. No one spoke of what they knew. Neighbors suspected, whispers traveled through the town, yet the family held tightly to their walls. They became their own world. Each child born carried the marks of both parent and sibling, a cycle that made their faces familiar yet increasingly distorted. It wasn't the kind of deformity you notice immediately, but rather something you can't put into words. A gaze that didn't align, a jaw too small to hold the teeth inside it, movements that seemed just slightly out of rhythm with the world around them. The family learned to live with this, as if it was natural, as if the outside world was the one that was strange. This is where their story becomes more than just skeeto, andal, or rumor, because what happened in that bedroom and in the years that followed shows us how fragile human bloodlines truly are. It forces us to ask questions most people would rather avoid. What happens when a family is cut off from the world long enough that its branches have nowhere else to grow? How far can a tree bend before it breaks? And when it doesn't break, what does it become? The truth is, the most inbred family tree didn't spread across the land like others do. It grew inward, downward, tighter and tighter, until it no longer resembled a tree at all. It became a knot, a tangled, suffocating knot that no one wanted to untangle, because to do so would mean confronting what had been allowed to grow in plain sight, hidden behind closed doors, inside a single bedroom. The origin of that knot lies in the first generation, the ones who chose silence over exposure. A brother and a sister perhaps, or a father and his daughter. The records are too fragile, the memories too stained to give us certainty. But what is known is this: the tree sprouted from relations that never should have happened, bonds that defied the natural order, and once it began, it could not be undone. For in families like this, secrecy is stronger than shame, and repetition becomes survival. The bedroom became both cradle and prison, a place where bloodlines were folded back into themselves again and again. The first children born of this arrangement carried whispers of their origins in their features: a slightly misshapen head, a slurred way of speaking, a learning difficulty that could not be explained away. In another family, in another town, these signs might have been noticed, questioned, even stopped, but here they were not. Here, they were simply absorbed into the rhythm of life. Because the family did not mix with outsiders, no comparisons were made. No one measured their faces against the faces of children at school, because most of them never set foot in a classroom. No one measured their minds against the minds of others, because they rarely spoke to anyone outside their blood. This isolation created a cycle so airtight it suffocated. Each generation born from the same narrow pool of genes inherited more than just physical traits. They inherited a worldview that made this pattern acceptable. The children grew up believing this was what families did, that their parents had done it before them, and so would they. And so the family tree thickened with repetition until it was less a tree and more a vine coiling around itself, choking its own growth. When outsiders did catch glimpses of the family, they struggled to explain what they saw. Some spoke of strange expressions, uncanny movements, an unsettling sameness in the eyes of children born years apart. Others remembered the eerie quiet, the way the family moved together, spoke in half-sentences, and avoided strangers with a gaze that lingered too long. These fragments of memory would live on in local gossip, but the full truth remained locked inside the walls of that one room. For the family knew that exposure meant death and secrecy meant survival, and so they chose survival, no matter the cost to the children who came after. As the decades passed, the tree grew more tangled. By the third generation, the effects of confinement could no longer be disguised. Children were born with eyes that wandered in different directions, with jaws too small to close, with bodies that struggled to keep balance. Their speech came out in fractured tones, words breaking apart before reaching the ear. To the outside world, these were the unmistakable marks of bloodlines colliding too many times. But inside the family, they were simply life. There was no word for deformity, no language for difference. To them, the only world that mattered was the one reflected back in the faces of their kin, no matter how distorted those faces became. Isolation deepened the curse. Without outside contact, the family carried forward every weakness, every mutation, every crack in the human blueprint, and with each birth, the cracks widened. Yet strangely, some children grew almost normal, their features less warped, their minds sharper. This unevenness gave the family a fragile hope that perhaps they were not doomed, that perhaps their blood still held a chance of survival. But that hope came at a terrible cost, for it justified the cycle's continuation, a cycle that would only dig them deeper into their own decay. Locals began to fear the family, not because of violence, but because of what they represented. To see them was to glimpse a mirror of human fragility, the truth that civilization is thin and nature does not forgive what is repeated too many times. People whispered of them as if they were cursed, not fully human, a living warning carved into flesh and bone. Children from nearby farms were told not to wander too close to their property. Doors were locked earlier, prayers spoken louder, as though their very existence invited misfortune. And yet, despite the whispers, no one intervened. No law stepped in. No church broke through their walls. Generation after generation, the family continued in their hidden rhythm, untouched, unchecked. In the end, it wasn't just their silence that allowed the tree to coil upon itself. It was the silence of everyone around them. A collective refusal to confront what was happening in plain sight. A silence so loud it echoes even now, when their names are nearly forgotten, but their story still haunts the soil they once walked on. By the fourth and fifth generations, the family's world had shrunk to a point where even their memories no longer reached beyond themselves. The old stories of how it began were fading, buried under years of repetition, until the children born could not even imagine a life outside their bloodline. To them, the idea of marrying a stranger, of stepping beyond the property line, was not just unthinkable. It was impossible. They had been born into a closed circle, and the circle had become their prison. The deformities grew sharper. Faces lengthened unnaturally, jaws jutted forward, tongues struggled to form words. Some children never spoke at all, communicating only in sounds and gestures. Others developed a strange mimicry, repeating phrases they had overheard without understanding them. It was as though language itself was collapsing, bending inward the same way their bloodline had. The family tree was no longer producing branches. It was producing echoes, fragments of what once was human speech, human form, human life. And yet, in this darkness, there were moments of unsettling tenderness. Parents still rocked their children to sleep. Brothers still defended sisters. There was laughter, even if it sounded broken. This was not a family of monsters, but of human beings trapped in a cycle they did not choose, living out the consequences of decisions made long before they were born. That is what makes their story so haunting, the realization that they loved as we love, suffered as we suffer, and yet carried a burden so heavy it warped their very bodies. To outsiders, glimpses of the family became folklore. A stranger seen wandering barefoot on a dirt road, muttering words no one could understand. A pair of children with the same mismatched eyes staring silently from the edge of the woods. Tales of their existence spread through rural towns, passed from mouth to mouth. That like a warning. Few had proof, but all had heard the whispers. Somewhere, hidden away, a family tree had been growing from a single bedroom, curling inward until it no longer resembled the rest of us. The family themselves did not know they were a cautionary tale. They did not know the world outside was speaking of them in hushed tones, painting them as shadows and omens. All they knew was survival. And survival meant continuing the cycle, no matter how strange their children became, no matter how much further the knot tightened around them. By the 6th generation, survival had become indistinguishable from decay. Children were born who could not walk upright, their legs bowed beneath the weight of bodies that had lost the strength of their ancestors. Some never learned to speak a word, their voices trapped inside them, their only communication a series of groans or sharp cries. Others developed strange, exaggerated features, foreheads too wide, jaws that jutted out grotesquely, eyes set too far apart. It was no longer a question of resemblance. The bloodline had turned them into something entirely apart, a mirror cracked beyond repair. And yet the family endured. In a world that had turned its back on them, they found ways to continue. The bedroom was still the center of their existence, the place where the cycle renewed itself. Outsiders might call it a chamber of horror, but to them, it was simply home. The walls were thick with generations of breath, the floor worn by bare feet pacing in circles. It was a room where children were conceived, born, and sometimes died without ever stepping beyond its doorway. The neighbors who dared speak of them described the family in tones of unease. They said the children's eyes never seemed to blink in rhythm, that their smiles stretched too wide or came at the wrong moment. They said the family carried an eerie silence with them, even when gathered in groups, as if their words had been stolen by the bloodline itself. There were rumors of violence, of madness, of rituals whispered in the dark. But the truth was far simpler and far more devastating. It was the slow unraveling of what happens when isolation is left to run its course. By now, the family's existence had become more legend than reality. Few could say they had seen them with their own eyes. Fewer still dared to approach their land. The family had become a boundary itself, a dark line drawn across the map, where civilization ended and something older, more fragile began. Parents warned their children, never go near that house, never wander into those woods, and so the family remained, hidden yet present, their story written not in words but in bodies that carried the history of every generation before them. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have left, or would the knot have tightened around you too? By the 7th generation, the family tree no longer looked like a tree at all. Its branches were so tightly wound that they could not be separated, so tangled that the original trunk had disappeared into the knot. What remained was something closer to a circle, endless, suffocating, self-consuming. The children born of this era carried every mark of what had come before. Bodies frail and uneven, minds clouded with confusion, speech reduced to fragments. And yet, they lived. That was the most haunting part. They lived, they breathed, and in their own way, they carried forward the weight of a history that could not end. The land around them grew quieter. Neighbors moved away, roads shifted, towns declined. Time itself seemed to forget the family, leaving them buried in the soil like an old root that refuses to rot. No government census could capture them, no church claimed them. They became ghosts of the present, alive but unseen. Their story survived not in written records, but in whispers, in photographs too unsettling to publish, in fragments passed down by those who had seen them once and never forgot. When you look at the arc of their history, you are faced with a question most would rather turn away from. Was this family a tragedy of circumstance, cut off, abandoned, left to consume itself? Or was it a reflection of something deeper, a truth about what happens when human beings are left too long in silence, when shame builds walls higher than love can climb? There is no simple answer, only the haunting realization that the line between survival and destruction is far thinner than we want to believe. The most inbred family tree in America did not spread across counties or states. It did not produce famous names or powerful legacies. It grew quietly, secretly, inwardly, from one bedroom, a single room that became the soil for generations of suffering, and the family itself may be gone now. Their shadow lingers. In every abandoned farmhouse, in every whisper of the woods, in every uneasy silence of small-town America, there lies the reminder that human history is not just built on triumphs and progress, it is also built on knots of blood and silence that twist themselves tighter until they cannot be undone. This was one of them, a tree that never reached for the sky, a tree that grew only into itself, a family that lived, suffered, and died within the walls of a single room, leaving behind a story we were never meant to know.